We've just closed out the first month of the 2017 hurricane season, thankfully with no major storms hitting the U.S. And as we look at these beautiful images of Galveston, Texas, we're reminded that the next Katrina or Andrew could be brewing any day now. But bad as those two storms were, they were nothing compared to the storm that hit Galveston and the Texas coast back in 1900. At the time, the Weather Service did not name hurricanes. But even without a name, the great storm will never be forgotten. The idyllic beaches of Galveston, Texas. More than 6 million vacationers come here each year, frolicking on the serene shores of the Gulf of Mexico. It's hard to believe, seeing it today, that this peaceful place was the epicenter of the greatest natural disaster in the history of the United States. It was 1900, and Galveston was thriving. The largest city in all of Texas, a booming population, building fortunes from Galveston's busy commercial port, shipping cotton and receiving goods from Europe.
Galveston was on an incredible growth pattern. It was, without a doubt, the Queen City of the Gulf. It rightfully earned that title.
September 8th, 1900 began as a day a lot like this one, with clear skies and calm seas. But the skies suddenly turned black. The weather took a terrifying turn. The good people of Galveston had virtually no defense against the great storm sweeping in from the sea. A Category 4 hurricane lashed the island community. It carried no name, as was the practice of the time. Winds up to 140 miles an hour, and worse, a storm surge of seawater 15 feet high overwhelmed the unprotected city, leveling buildings and homes.
In 1900, the storm on September 8th came across the island and pushed water and pushed wind across the island, destroying most of the houses, and many lives were lost.
In an instant, half of Galveston was gone. Homes along the shoreline ripped off their foundations, the storm smashing them into kindling. One of the heartbreaking stories of that terrible night took place at St. Mary's Orphanage, a Catholic home for children built right on the shoreline. Nuns, terrified by the rising seas, tethered themselves to their children, determined to protect the little ones from being swept away.
The nuns decided it would be safer to tie the children together in groups of 10.
But the sisters' brave attempt to save lives would be in vain. By the time the howling wind subsided and the ocean returned to its normal level, an estimated 12,000 Americans were dead, 6,000 of them right here in Galveston. It is still to this day the deadliest natural disaster in U.S. history, a horrible event commemorated by this poignant statue on the Galveston seawall. When the storm passed, dazed survivors emerged to a Galveston they could not recognize. City streets filled with mountains of rubble.
The debris from the houses and properties and animals and things that accumulated during the course of the storm became a wall of debris that protected the northern part of the island from the rest of the storm and water. So we know that that debris line extended for maybe 2 miles, and in some places was as much as 2 stories in height.
Galvestonians dug through the rubble, desperately searching for survivors, but locating virtually none. They found only bodies, among them 10 Catholic nuns and 90 orphans, still tied together. Only 3 of the St. Mary's orphans survived the storm.
I often think about what they would have experienced walking out their door on the next day and looking at what had happened and what was around them.
But this battered community would not be beaten. Neighbors pitched in, helping neighbors and finding solace wherever possible.
The Grand became a place of priority for this city because it was a place of healing. It was a place that was non-religious, non-political. It was a place where people came to gather.
Galveston's Grand Opera House, though severely damaged in the storm, became a source of comfort and hope for the shaken residents of a once grand city.
They could weep together over the horrible loss of life and the devastation of that storm, or they might come and laugh for a moment and forget about their problems.
And though the great storm of 1900 brought this booming city to its knees, the people of Galveston rebuilt and fortified, constructing a seawall bolstered by granite boulders 17 feet high and 6 miles long to face the Gulf and protect them from future storms. They also pumped sand on top of obliterated sections of their city, raising the island as much as 18 feet near the seawall. Any surviving buildings that could be jacked up off their foundations were lifted to the new grade. Some were simply too large. This ceiling that we're standing under is very low, but it wasn't built that way.
No, it would have actually been 13 feet. The floor is 8 feet higher than it would have been in the original structure. And they filled in the island as much as 18 feet in parts. And so it feels like the ceilings come down and the floor has gone up. But it was a phenomenal project.
Now, talk about that. I mean, in those days, they didn't have Caterpillar tractors and excavators and things like that.
It's amazing what they did. They used horses and manpower and pulleys and wagons, and somehow they raised so many buildings in this city and protected them from future storms.
The Great Storm took the lives of 1 out of every 6 Galvestonians. Some who did survive simply moved away. Galveston would never again be the biggest city in Texas. But in the months and years after, the determination and ingenuity of those who stayed breathed life back into a community that Mother Nature left for dead.
The spirit of the people of Galveston is really what's important to remember. And it's that spirit of we're not going to give up, we're going to make this our home, we're going to handle the storm if it happens, but we're going to come back and we're still going to be a great city for the future.
Hard to believe, 10,000 to 12,000 people died in that storm. And even here in New York, they had fundraisers. There was a big fundraiser at the Waldorf thrown by William Randolph Hearst, the newspaper man, and the keynote speaker, a guy named Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain. They raised $50,000 to help with the rebuilding of Galveston, which in those days was a huge amount of money.
Well, that was a beautifully done story. The historic photos were incredible, and I think the most fascinating part was not just the ingenuity that was shown there in rebuilding that community, the engineering feats involved, but I can't help but think, this is more than 100 years ago that it had such a tremendous impact on generations of families.
And we are so fortunate and so blessed today to have the satellite imagery. We know these days when hurricanes are coming and we can prepare for them. Back then they had absolutely no warning.